Hi, I'm Brad Peebler, and this is LightWave 3D Render 2. In this tape, we're going to be talking about ray tracing, radiosity, caustics, and high dynamic range data. A lot of advanced functions inside of the LightWave render engine, so we've got a lot to cover. Let's get started. We're going to start off by taking a look at ray tracing, and here we have a render of the standard benchmark scene in LightWave 3D called ray trace. This scene shows off a lot of different ray tracing functions, from refraction, you can see in this crystal sphere in the front, reflections all over the scene, and of course shadows on the ground here cast from the spheres. Now the way that ray tracing works is that when LightWave is generating pixels, from the camera's perspective, it fires rays. So we have a little scene here I've actually mocked up as if we can see two virtual rays being fired out from the camera. And you'll see as they reach out in the scene, when they hit a surface, they reflect back. And you can see them reflecting back to different directions, and then that direction is accumulated and put back into the original pixel. So again, if we take a look at it from the top view here, you can see the ray traced rays firing out, hitting a particular reflective surface, then going out, continuing, and back. So if we look at this ray here in particular, you can see it hitting initially the back wall. From there it deflects off and hits another wall, then reflects one more time, and finally resides on that, which means this pixel, which the camera was looking at originally, is going to see a reflection of this wall, which is also seeing a reflection of this wall. And if we look in the final image, you can see an example of that. So if we imagine that ray that traced out here hit this wall, reflected back. From back here it saw the reflection of the room from that wall, then went back, again, recursed several times back and forth. And that's using ray traced reflections. Now in LightWave Render 1, the first rendering tape, we covered the rendering options panel, and we saw how you can activate ray trace shadows, ray trace reflections, and ray trace refraction. You can see these are all on. Now one of the things we also talked about was the ray recursion limit, which we see here. Right now this is set at 16. Okay, that means that that little ray example we just saw in LightWave would actually bounce 16 times back and forth. And you can see all these spheres back here in the background that have been reflected because that ray was traced 16 recursions. Now this is actually by default a little higher than what you'd see in previous versions of LightWave. So you can actually dial this down a little bit, and what that'll do is it'll speed up your render times. So let me load up another image here, and we'll take a look at a ray recursion of 7. You can see a ray recursion of 16 was 5 minutes and 6 seconds to render. A ray recursion of 7 was only 3 minutes and 24 seconds. So we cut it down almost in half, and you can see the difference here. This is the ray recursion of 7, and here's ray recursion of 16. So you see if we switch back and forth, you can see you get fewer rays recursed back there into the background. This still looks pretty good, looks really good actually, but it saves you about half the render time. So it's a method to save time at the expense of accuracy. Of course, if you want to dial that up, you'll get more and more spheres reflected back in the background. So it really depends on the scene that you're working on, what level of recursion you want. A lot of times when you're working on a scene, you may not actually even really see the recursion. The reflections may be so small, or surfaces may not be bouncing back and forth. This is a pretty extreme example. But I do recommend that when you do your test renders, try various settings of ray recursion, because you really can optimize your rendering that way. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the different types of ray tracing. Actually, let me load up the geometry so you can see the actual scene here. And again, this is just a little scene that I put together, pretty straightforward. If we look through the camera's view, you can see some objects here, a single light in the scene, and I've actually pre-rendered these, so let's just go ahead and load up the different frames. Okay, so we'll start off by looking at this frame rendered with no ray tracing. And you can see here it is, fairly boring scene, okay? Looks pretty cool. You've got just your regular surfaces. You can see this is a little bit transparent here. You'll notice there's no refraction going on, no reflection, no shadows. So let's go ahead and take a look at, if we just turn on shadows, here we can say immediately the scene starts to look a lot more realistic. Okay, this is actually using an area light, which gives us those nice soft edge shadows. And we've learned about that in Render 1 as well. And again, you can see now it looks more realistic, but it's still lacking some depth. These are pretty flat surfaces. So let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like if we just activate reflections. So now we have reflections and no shadows. You can see now the reflections here. These are ray traced reflections, so they're going to reflect the environment. Let's take a look at refraction. So you can see here the refractive surface now gives you a nice interesting refraction of the object beneath it, and it's also now refracting the object over here as well. And we can see how this looks with all ray traces activated. And now you get a pretty cool looking scene there. And you've got the ray traced shadows, the ray traced reflections, which is tracing the environment, and of course the refraction. Now, to set this up, of course, there are some settings beyond just the render options panel. Obviously, on render options here, you're going to have your ray traced shadows, your ray traced reflection, your ray traced refraction, all turned on to get those effects. However, there are some surface parameters that have to be set to actually see these properly in LightWave. So what we need to do is go to the surface editor here, and then you tell it which surfaces you want to have particular qualities. Okay, now most of these the surfacing parameters are covered in Surface 1. We'll go ahead and give you a real quick rundown of what's going on here. For example, the sphere, as we saw earlier in the final rendered scene, has reflections on that, okay? Which means we have to tell the surface that it's actually reflective. So if we go in here, you'll actually set this up to about 30% to get a nice soft reflection there. Now, another very important attribute to reflection is on the Environment tab. All right? Now, in this case, we had turned on ray tracing and backdrop. So if we look at the frame again, you can see, yes, it's ray tracing the environment, and it's also reflecting the backdrop, which in this case was gray. Now, you can also set that to ray tracing and spherical map. And if we take a look here at this frame, you can see there's a mountain highway image, which if we take a look here, it's this image right here, using as a spherical map to do the reflection. So it's doing the ray tracing and the spherical map. And again, on the surface panel you can see ray tracing plus spherical. If you want to, you can do reflections with spherical map only. And the way that's going to look, we can see here, still looks pretty realistic, but you'll notice now it's not reflecting any of the objects around it. Okay, so again, if we take a look at this one, let's go ahead and clear out this from the middle there. Okay, you can see there's just reflection mapping, and there's reflection and ray tracing. Reflection mapping and ray tracing. Reflection mapping is going to render significantly faster because it's not actually tracing rays. It's just a way to cheat reflections. And it does look pretty good, but again, it lacks the photorealistic quality of having the environment ray traced around it. So a spherical reflection map is essentially a global map that gets applied to only the reflections. So you're not going to see that anywhere else. If I had put that image in the background, I could also use the background reflection option that was on that Advanced tab. So keeping in mind that when you use a spherical reflection map, it's just sort of a virtual wrap of the image in a big giant sphere around the entire world. And anything inside that world will then, its rays will see that giant virtual map that's wrapped around the universe. All right, let's talk a little bit about refraction here. Again, you can see nice refractive settings on the glass surface here. And again, you're going to find that on the basic panel here. You get transparency. Have to have transparency on a little bit, otherwise it can't refract, of course. And then you need to set your refractive index. And this is just basically how severely a ray gets bent or turned as it goes through the surface. There's an entire listing of refractive indices in the LightWave 6 manual. So if you want, you can actually just go in, look at that chart, and dial in exactly the value that you want for a particular surface. If you're doing leaded glass or crystal or water, there's actually settings for those right there listed in the manual. And essentially what that's telling you is as the ray comes into the surface, how much to deflect that ray off as it goes through the refractive surface. So for example, if you're going into the surface of water, we know that it refracts like this. So you look in the refractive table, dial in that number, and it's going to give you that exact amount of distortion through that surface. Okay, and the final option under the ray tracing panel here is, of course, the ray trace optimization. I generally turn this on, especially when I'm doing my test renders. It's a good idea. It's going to give you a nice little speed boost. The only issue there is there are sometimes surfaces, concave or convex surfaces that can give you some distortion. So you want to keep an eye. If you see any errors in ray trace shadows, you just click that back off and you should be fine. It's going to be a little less accurate, but it can be a whole lot faster in certain circumstances. Now, whereas with ray tracing, the rays are being fired from the camera and bouncing around the scene, radiosity works a little bit differently. Now, first of all, it's important to understand what radiosity is. So we are talking about, when we talk about radiosity, is the effect of light bouncing off surfaces to illuminate other surfaces in the scene. Okay, so for example, if you're in a room where there's light only coming in through the window, you'll notice that the entire room is lit, but even though there are certain surfaces that are not in direct line of fire from those sun's rays, and that's because the sun's rays are bouncing off the floor and scattering all over the room to illuminate the rest of the environment. LightWave can now do that same thing using a function called, of course, radiosity. Let's go ahead and take a look at how radiosity works. It's sort of an inverted ray tracing. So first of all, explain exactly how that functions, and then we'll look about how to use it. Okay, let's just go ahead and load up some images here. Okay, there we go. Now, if we take a look at the first frame here, this is a simple room, and you can see it's being illuminated by a light up here. A little bit, very little light is actually shining on the ceiling. Most of the light is happening direct, and this is the way you would normally see something in 3D. All right. Now, what happens is, rather than tracing the rays from the camera, as LightWave is rendering each pixel, rays are fired from the pixel. We can see here as an example visually how from this pixel rays are being fired out randomly, and several things are being calculated here. When the ray hits the surface, that pixel notes what color that pixel that it hits is and how far the ray had to travel. Okay, so here you can see several rays have hit this red surface and they didn't have to travel very far. However, these rays have gone off and hit gray surfaces. This one might even hit a blue surface over here, but they've actually had to travel a long distance. So it calculates, or it accumulates all those pixel values that it's hit, and then based on the distances they had to travel, it assigns a weight to that value and then averages them in. If we go to the next frame here, you can see now, instead of just having this sort of white pyramid here, you now have a more reddish tint. It's actually tinted a little bit red and blue. You can see this is actually an expanded view of the pixel. Doesn't look like the same color, but actually is directly sampled from that pixel right there, expanded out. So it has the illusion that it's a little darker than that really is, but that is the actual pixel color. What's happened there is, again, it traveled out, shot those rays, and then accumulated the colors, and because these rays were closer and there were more of them, it tilted it more towards red. You can see this side, which is facing the blue, gets tilted a little bit more towards blue. However, because it's traveling a long distance to the blue and probably traveling lesser distance to the gray areas, it's a little lighter blue than this is red because it's going to factor in those gray colors as well. So when LightWave fires those rays, there are actually some user settings that you have to choose to tell it how many rays to fire. Now what we're talking about right now is it firing rays from every single pixel, and that's when we set a tolerance of 0. Let's look at the radiosity settings so we can see exactly what we're talking about here as we talk about the different number of rays and, of course, the tolerance settings. So if we go to our lights panel, just minimize this guy here, we can either go there by choosing the lights option here and then clicking Item Properties. Then at the top of this panel you see the Global Illumination button. Now you can also go directly there. If you look at the top of the screen here on the Lights tab, you can hit Lights here, and then you'll notice on the side here there's a button for Global Illumination. Takes you right there. Just a quick way to get there. If you've got a Lights panel open, you can get there directly from the panel, or you can go there from the Lights tab. Now over here you can see there's the Enable Radiosity button. I'm going to go ahead and disable caustics for the moment. We'll get to that later. Now when we enable radiosity, you'll see now by default tolerance is set to 0. And we're going to discuss a little later how tolerance affects the scene. Right now we're going to discuss it based on a 0 tolerance setting, which means every pixel in the scene will be evaluated. Now in this case, we've got a rays per evaluation set at 4 by 12, which is the default. I'm going to go ahead and set this down to 2 by 6, and now I've got a visual example of what that means. All right, here we can see basically this is the representation of a single pixel. All right? And what LightWave does is it creates a cell around that pixel, fires the ray. So you can see this one in this case was segmented 2 segments this way and 6 segments around that way. All right? That's what it means by 2 by 6, this setting here. All right? 2 up and down, 6 across. And then again, those rays are all going to be fired off into space, and wherever a ray hits, it's going to calculate and then bring that back. Now, this is a very uniform array of rays being fired off, and that's not a good thing. If we always used the same scattering method, you'd see some very noticeable patterns in the final render because the pixels would always fire off and hit the exact same pixels in the rest of the room. So what you want is some random variation. It has to start from the same cell direction, but then randomly select a slightly different angle. So if we look at one more frame here, you'll see this is a visual representation of what sort of actually happens. It still uses the 2 by 6 settings, so a ray gets fired off of each one of these faces essentially, but they can be randomly scattered slightly. So you get a nice uniform number of pixels. It gives you a very accurate sampling of the scene, or a fairly accurate sample of the scene, but still keeps it fairly random so you don't see any kind of patterning from frame to frame to frame. You always get some random variation, which helps to smooth that out to remove any banding or other artifacts that you might see. Okay, let's just load up a scene here and talk about global illumination and radiosity. Going back out here, it's our global illumination setup. And this is actually just one of the robot characters from the robots directory. Little death's nail, it's kind of fun. This is just right off the stock LightWave scene. Now what I've done though is I've created what we call a sky dome. Okay? And in this case actually, a sky dome, generally what you'll do is create a flat plane for the ground and then a giant sphere around that object. So then you can put different surfaces on there. In this case, we're just going to use a flat ground plane. I've created just a large single polygon that's underneath the robot so they can cast some shadows. And then we're going to use the background settings or backdrop to illuminate the scene. You'll notice in the scene here, there's not much lighting going on in OpenGL. If we open up the lights panel, you can see we have a single light, and it does have an intensity of 100%, but the effect diffuse and effect specular are turned off, which means without radiosity we won't see anything. I'm going to go ahead and turn off radiosity right now and do a single render, and you'll see the character shades completely black because there is in fact no light shining on him. However, you'll see the background is a nice bright white. We set that up, of course, on the Scene tab under Backdrop, and you'll see there's our nice white setting. I've also got some fog set on, so it just sort of smooths out the area, the horizon here, so you get a nice soft horizon as opposed to a hard line. Now, if we activate global illumination, again, we'll go to our lights panel, global illumination, activate radiosity here. I'm going to go ahead and turn the rays down to 2 by 6 like we had earlier. Okay? I'm also going to change my camera settings so we have no anti-aliasing for the moment. That'll give us a nice, fast, quick render. Now I push F9 and you can see it's now rendering. You'll notice now he's being illuminated by the scene. Okay? Now he looks pretty good, but you notice that the ground around him is really grainy. Okay? That's because at each one of those pixels, it calculated the radiosity effect at every single pixel. But each one had its own random setting, but only 2 by 6 rays, so there can be some inaccuracies because there aren't that many rays there. So what we can do to improve that is increase the number of rays per pixel. All right, so again, we go to our global illumination panel, and you can see under rays per evaluation, you notice at 2 by 6, we're at nearly the worst setting. Okay, 1 by 3 would be the very worst, and these are great for test renders, but certainly you wouldn't want that for your final render. If we go ahead and set that up to say 4 by 12, and now we make a render, you see it's going to be a little bit slower. The robot's going to look about the same because his textures kind of hide the blotchiness. When we see the ground plane coming in here, you'll notice that it's much more accurate. Okay, still a little grainy, but the grain is not nearly as noticeable as it was a moment ago. Okay, there we go. A brief 19 seconds to get our cool global illumination render. Now there's another thing we can do to smooth this out. Actually, a few things we can do. First of all, let's go back to global illumination here, and you'll notice a button right above that called Shading Noise Reduction. If we activate that, what it's going to do is it's actually, while it's rendering, it'll contain a buffer of the shading information. So not the textures, just purely what's happening with lighting. And then LightWave will smooth that out to reduce any noise. So you can see here, if we look at our final render there, now, even though it's the same number of rays, by adding the shading noise reduction, you get a much smoother looking shadow there. If we can go back to the grainy version, and you can see how it smooths out pretty significantly from one to the next. Okay. Now there's another thing we can do for reducing the graininess there, and that's using anti-aliasing. So if we activate anti-aliasing here, this character, because it's moving, we would most likely use enhanced low anti-aliasing at least, and some motion blur. Okay. Now if we go to render that, what's going to happen at every pass, it's going to render that as we know from render 1, it's going to render this 5 times and then composite that back together. Because when each pixel fires its rays out for the radiosity calculation, it'll randomly choose a new direction to fire those rays. Each frame will have a slightly different jittered pattern. And each time it does that, it'll get that shading noise reduction. So you'll end up with 5 composite passes with 5 smoothed out versions of that radiosity solution. Those will get composited back together, and it'll give you a very nice smooth result. This allows us to actually do animation with radiosity without seeing any flickering and still have a reasonable time frame. It used to be you'd have to crank your rays per evaluation so high to get it to be smooth that it was great for still frames but not applicable for animations. Now with shading noise reduction, you can actually do animations with radiosity as well, and you won't see any flicker. Okay, and here's our final render. You'll see that took about 1:40 to render this frame, but again, you have a really nice smooth effect there on the lighting. It really gives it a nice realistic effect because it's getting light from all over the scene, including light that's bouncing off of the ground from the top here. Okay, so this brings us to the discussion of terminology differences between radiosity and global illumination. There are several companies out there that talk about a global illumination rendering engine. There are other people that talk about radiosity rendering engines. Essentially, they're the same thing. Radiosity is just the technique of bouncing light off of one surface to accumulate on another surface. Global illumination is talking about getting illumination for the entire scene. Okay? So most of the time you'll see this sort of sky dome render that we've just done associated with global illumination. It's really talking about using light from all around the object, whereas radiosity is referring to more like environments where you've got lights, single light sources coming in, then scattering the light around. Now, LightWave, as we've been showing you right now, uses 2 different methods of radiosity. One is when we're using the zero tolerance method, and every pixel gets calculated through the radiosity solution. You can also activate a tolerance threshold, which will then take a sampling of the scene to determine how much of the, or which pixels actually get calculated for radiosity. Let's take a look at that. If we go back into our global illumination panel, you can see here, you'll see that we've got our tolerance setting right here. Now what that's going to do, right now at 0, it means it has no tolerance. It is intolerant. So every single pixel will get calculated. If we set this up to say 0.3, we also need to leave our minimum evaluation spacing. We know that our scene here, if we look at the bottom corner, we'll see that our scene is set to 5mm grid. So if you see these little grid spaces here, these are 5mm each. If I set this up to minimum of 5mm, that means that no pixel within a 5mm distance of the next pixel will get calculated. Okay, that's really going to cut down the number of pixels that get evaluated, but it's also going to drastically cut down our accuracy. Let's go ahead and make a render here so we can take a look at that. I'm going to turn off the anti-aliasing once again so we can see that quickly. We'll render that out. Now you notice it rendered very quickly, and the robot still looks pretty good, but the shadow is almost completely gone. You can't see it because it didn't sample very accurately. All right. What happens when you increase the threshold is that it basically is going to choose randomly around the scene a number of pixels to evaluate. Okay, so if it chooses a random pixel, evaluates that pixel. Then it chooses pixel around it, and if the difference in shading is within that threshold amount, it will not calculate for that pixel. So it'll keep tracking and tracking until it finds a pixel outside of that threshold, then it'll fire rays from that one. Okay? Then the minimum evaluation spacing is a hard set, so when you get into like corners of walls and things like that, you can maintain a minimum threshold, so it'll never calculate 2 pixels that are within that hard set amount. So in this case, because our scene is fairly small, we needed to decrease that minimum evaluation spacing pretty significantly. So we'll set it down to, say, 1 millimeter. And now we'll render that. You'll see it renders a little bit more slowly. But again, we don't have much going on for the ground. So what we need to do here is turn our tolerance down. Set it down to about 0.1. And you can see it calculates. And now you can start to see some shadows coming in again. All right. Now what we can see, if we look here, shadows are there, but they're not very accurate. And what you can see is these little dots. And essentially what that is the dark dots there are spots where shadow is calculated. Okay, so that one pixel says, okay, I know I'm a dark shadow because it fired off its rays. And then all the pixels around it were close enough that it didn't calculate. It was within our tolerance or our minimum evaluation spacing. So once it got to a pixel that was available, if that pixel was white, then it just does a straight blend from the dark pixel to the light one. And that's how you get these big spots, these blotchy spots. Again, if I increase the number of rays per evaluation, that means each pixel is going to be more accurate. And it's going to take a little longer. It pre-calculates the radiosity bake. And here we go again. And you see now starting to become a little more accurate. And again, you can keep tweaking with these numbers. As you use a higher tolerance setting, you need a higher rays per evaluation. The minimum spacing amount is basically based on your scene. And again, even 1 millimeter on this scene is probably too high. So we might say 0.1 millimeters. And let's go with 0.2 tolerance and maybe a 12 by 36 rays. Again, it takes a little bit longer on the initial calculation, but you can see this is going to render pretty quickly. Now, the reason you want to use the tolerance setting is if you're doing architectural renderings or doing environments where you're doing a still frame, you can actually get a very, very quick radiosity solution. It's not going to be as accurate, but it'll look good. All right? What you don't want to do is render animations with tolerance settings because the tolerance, the pixels that are evaluated get selected randomly at each frame. And because there's going to be a wide difference from one frame to the next, you'll actually see quite a bit of flickering in that effect. So what you want to do if you're doing animation, set your tolerance to 0, and then keep your rays per evaluation as low as possible. Also keeping in mind that if you're using motion blur or multi-pass anti-aliasing, you're going to get free rays per evaluation at each pass. So if you're doing a test render with no anti-aliasing and 0 tolerance, you might have to have your rays per evaluation up at 4 by 12 or 8 by 16, one of those higher settings. Then keep in mind when you go to do your final render, if you're turning on medium anti-aliasing, you can drastically reduce your number of rays because the number of rays are essentially being multiplied by the number of times you re-render that frame. Okay, so if you're doing low anti-aliasing and you're doing 3 by 9 of the rays, you're actually calculating 15 by 45 rays because all those rays on each pass will be composited back together at the final integration phase. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about how we would build a sky dome environment for this guy. First of all, right now we've just been using the backdrop, and that's pretty good, but the backdrop is a little bit limiting in terms of surfacing. We might want to have some interesting surface on the environment around it. So what we'll do is we'll go into Modeler here, and just go ahead and zoom out. You can see what I've got here is the actual sky dome. Okay, so what we've got basically is a flat plane on the bottom, and then a half sphere that's wrapped around the environment. So we go back over here, we're actually going to bring that object in. So go ahead and remove the ground only version and bring in the sky dome that has the ground and the sky. Okay, so now you can see on our sky dome we've got a setting of white here. So if we want, we can change the overall look and feel of the render just by decreasing, or by changing the color rather. So now the dome that's around the environment is kind of a light bluish. Let's go back to our global illumination settings. Put this back down to 0 threshold and decrease our rays. Now I also need to go to our scene volumetrics and turn off our fog. The reason we have to do that is that the fog settings are actually within that giant sky dome, and the fog will overrun the sky dome because the fog basically fogs out the dome itself. So if we turn that off, then we'll be able to see the blue, and the pixels that make up the ground and the robot will also be able to see the blue dome. So now if we make a render, you can see immediately as it's rendering here, our little guy is a little darker, and he's tilted towards blue. Okay, and then once he's done, you can see the ground plane, which normally was white, is now picking up that blue illumination from the sky around it. Now the interesting thing with this is it doesn't work just for color. You can actually change procedural textures as well. So if you want to put a procedural texture on the dome or a gradient on the dome, you can do some pretty interesting lighting effects. Now one thing that's important to keep in mind is that because the radiosity solution is sending off a random number of rays to calculate, if you have really harsh settings, really contrasty settings on your environment dome, you can get some really strange looking results on the radiosity render. And you'd have to crank up the number of rays to make sure it's taking an accurate sample. In other words, if you're going to use a texture or a procedural on that dome, make sure it's a nice soft fall off from one color to the next. Otherwise, you can get some fairly strange results. Okay, now one thing you'll notice is with the colored dome here, we're really not getting a lot of lighting effect because the color itself is just a straight out blue. If we go to the surface editor here, you can see the blue is 255 by 158 by 155. Now what we really need is a high dynamic range on this. So right now, that's a regular sort of integer-based value. And in LightWave, we can actually have high dynamic range values, which means it goes way beyond that 255. This really assists in working with radiosity. Now, lights are the most obvious way to set up a high dynamic range map or high dynamic range data. So what I'm going to do is show you how HDRD works. That's high dynamic range data with lights, and then we'll talk about how to create a surface that also has HDRD. Okay, so we're going to just load up a scene here quickly, and this is a scene that I just put together. It's very, very simple. This scene just has 3 different lights. We can see here, 1, 2, 3 spotlights. And we've got a little chart over here that shows 0%, 100%, 200%, 300%. And as I drag my slider, the lights are getting brighter. They're actually using an expression to tie it to the scale of this object here. So that right there is about 100% brightness for these lights. If I keep going, though, you can see it starts to wash out the color because the lights are getting oversaturated. All right, so that's how the lights react. Now, if we go to our rendering options here, I'm going to turn on my image viewer. I'm just going to use the regular image viewer, okay? And we're going to go to maybe frame 70 or 80, where it's at about 200%, and we'll make a render here. And you see, again, it really washes out on the final render, gives you a nice looking effect. But what I want to do is show you some of the pixel values. So if we zoom in here, you can see at the top of the bar, it shows, if I click down, it shows 3 values, actually 4 values. This is going to be red, green, blue, and the alpha channel. All right, the alpha channel should always be at 255 because there's no transparency here. The color values change as I move my little slider around here. You can see this would be tilted more towards green, with green at 255. This is more towards red. And you see in the middle here, when we get the really hot spot, you'll notice that it's maxed out at 255, 255, 255. That's because the regular image viewer can only display images within that range, or pixels within that range. However, LightWave calculates well beyond that range. So to see that, we need to use Image Viewer FP. Stands for floating point. We open that up. Now when we do the render, again, same thing happens with inside the rendering engine, but now when it goes to display, instead of throwing out or clamping the values at that 255 maximum, it can go well beyond that. So again, here we can see now what happens with floating point is it has to go to a percentage base, because floating point values essentially go from 0 to 1. Okay, instead of 0 to 255, it's 0 to 1 or 0 to 100%. So when we actually go back here and look at the screen, you'll see that as I click in here, even if I get right into the middle here, you'll see instead of 255, 255, 255, we have a color. You'll notice if you look at the top, the green value is almost 200%, whereas the red and blue are about 120% each. If you move around, you can see this does go well beyond. Even when we go over here to the green spot, the green here is still over 100%. Okay? And it's that range that allows us to really do some interesting things. So for example, if we take and go to frame 150, where this is totally washed out, let's go ahead and make a render here. And it's going to look completely white. It doesn't, it looks like it's completely washed. But we'll see if we open up our frame here and I start clicking around, even though the image looks just completely white, you'll notice that the settings at the top, the settings for red and blue are around 115. The setting for green is 175. So LightWave still knows that that pixel is more green than anything else, even though a traditional image format or regular monitors can only show it as white. Okay, so as we drag back over here, to the naked eye, this pixel looks the same as this pixel. But we can see numerically that this pixel is much more green, whereas this pixel is much more red. So to illustrate this, I'm going to open up the image control panel here, and we'll turn on exposure. We saw this on render 1. We know that we can activate the exposure, and now we can change the white point. So we can increase what is actually white. Let's just turn that up to 1.5, and you'll see it starts to show you the colors that we saw before. If we crank that up to 2 or 3, you can see now, yes, that in fact these pixels were red, these pixels were green. If we turn off the exposure, you see in their full range of brightness, it really blows it out. But the color data is still there. Now what this means is, if you had a room with these lights set up and you were calculating radiosity, the light that bounced off of that would actually tilt objects towards red or green, depending on which pixels they saw during the evaluation. So it's very important that LightWave stores all that high dynamic range data at the time of render. Okay? It's also important for image processing, because you can do things like the HDR expose. You can use the LightWave virtual darkroom, which we'll talk about a little bit later, for treating these high dynamic range images to create what looks more photorealistic. More like it's been printed to film, because this is exactly what happens when you take a photograph in the real world. Lighting is stored in that linear format, and lighting can of course go to 10,000, 100,000, 200,000% what you would see on a computer monitor. Luckily LightWave calculates that internally, and LightWave also supports images that are created in some of the new high dynamic range formats. Let's take a look at some of those high dynamic range images. Now these come with LightWave 3D. So if we just go here to our image editor, inside of our LightWave content directory, in the 6 projects directory, under radiosity, you'll find under images here, if you set your file type to all files, because these are non-standard images, these PIC files, let's just go ahead and load up the one that says kitchen probe. Okay, and now we can see, if we open that up, here's our kitchen probe image. Now this image here was created by Paul Dubevic, and essentially the technique for creating these images, there are no cameras right now that will capture a high dynamic range image. There's research being done, and there's development in the works for creating high dynamic range cameras, but there are none commercially available. So what Paul has done is, using a mirrored sphere, taking several photographs of that mirrored sphere at different exposure settings, then compositing those with some special software called Make HDR. This is available online through the internet. If you do a search for high dynamic range images, you can generally pick that up. Now, what you'll see here are the areas in the background and on the ceiling where there are bright lights. It really becomes washed out. Okay, this is the overall composited image. Now, just like before, if we drag around on the screen, notice the pixel settings. You'll see where the light is here. It shows that that light is 10,400% red, 6,700% green, and 2,800 blue. All right. Back here in the window, if we look out the window, you'll see that it's really tilted towards blue, whereas red is 2,400, green is 3,600, blue is 5,600. Okay, but you can't tell that here. However, if we open up our image controls again, and we'll go ahead and move this up a little bit, get my panel there. There we go, so you can see that. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and set our exposure on again, and I'm going to crank up our white point to like 5 and our black point to 500. You see it starts to bring this into focus. So we'll keep going up, we'll set that maybe to 10, and this to 1,000, and we keep going. And basically, as you'll notice now, the ceiling light is sort of in focus, and the reflections on the table are now in there. Keep cranking this up. We have to go up to 5,000. And I usually keep these within a factor of 10 from each other. Now you can start to see, yep, back there in the sky is actually blue. However, we have to get really cranked up to see that. And you can see finally the blue sky in the background. That's a little bit too far. There we go. So you can see by underexposing essentially, now everything that was in that window becomes clear. So you can see, yes, those are in fact blue pixels outside there. So it's kind of like we're working in a photo lab here, just re-exposing the film to show us different areas. Again, you can see without the exposure setting turned on, the entire range, that entire high dynamic range of pixels is displayed. And once we've exposed it here, you can see a clamped down version. Again, these high dynamic range images can be used as spherical maps in a sky dome or as a background environment, and then when LightWave calculates radiosity, when it fires off a pixel and it hits one of these high dynamic range pixels, it knows that it should illuminate that pixel that it fired from very brightly, tilted towards blue or red or green depending on the percentage setting of the high dynamic range map. Now, one of the great things about these high dynamic range images being supported in LightWave is that we can actually use this image to illuminate a 3D scene. So it'll actually take these high dynamic range pixels and use those as light sources inside the 3D world. Let's go ahead and load up a scene here. And we've got our little friend the robot again, just because he's fun. Okay, there he is. Now we're going to load in that kitchen probe again. So we go back out to our images directory, and there's our kitchen probe. Okay, very good. Now what we want to do is make this the environment. Now earlier when we were using the sky dome for lighting, we actually used geometry. I showed you how you can use a background color and how you can put a half dome in the environment. We could use the half dome and then map this image on it, but what I'm going to do is use a plugin called Image World. And this is a background replacement plugin. Let's take a look how we do that. On the Scene tab, under the backdrop setting, you can see this is where we would normally set our background color. But down here on the bottom, there's an Add Environment pop-up. And what we can do is go down to this one right here called Image World. If we choose that, now we can actually open that up, and it shows you that it wants a light probe image. We choose that light probe. What that's going to do is actually algorithmically unwrap that light probe image. Okay, those pictures that are taken using the mirrored sphere actually have a specific attribute to unwrap those around a sphere. And we've got that algorithm built right in to Image World. So all we have to do is choose the kitchen probe image. The heading and pitch offset allows you to rotate where the seam angle is, essentially. And then a brightness setting, and we'll leave that at 100%. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a rendered frame there. Okay, so here we have the final rendered frame. This took about 10 minutes to render. You can see there. Now what you'll notice is the image itself is very white. The ground plane here is very, very white. Well, if we take a look at the kitchen probe itself, again, when we were looking at the values of these pixels, remember how blisteringly bright they were, in the tune of 2,000 and 3,000%. Back here, even brighter than that, 7,000%, almost 10,000% on some of these pixels. So that explains why when we use it to illuminate the scene, it creates a very, very bright result. Well, once again, we can expose that with HDR expose. So if we set the exposure setting back on here, and again, because these are so bright, we'll crank up the white point to maybe 3, and immediately you can see now the ground plane coming in. We'll crank up the black point a little bit, and now you can see the nice shadow here. You can see the ground plane a little bit better. It's a little bit more reasonable. And one of the things that's really interesting that you'll notice is that this shadow here is tilted towards blue. And why is that happening? Well, the shadow is very defined because on the light probe image itself, you've got the very bright light coming from here, which is shining down on the robot, casting the dark shadow on the right-hand side of the robot. However, these pixels back here, remember those were blue. Even though they're really bright, they're bright blue. So when they come in, they miss the robot, and they actually illuminate the shadow with a blue tint. And that's how you get that blue spill there in the shadow area. So you get some really natural looking lighting effects by using the HDR image and the HDR exposed to pull the shadows up out of that image. Now another thing we can do with the Image World plugin is if the pixels are so bright, you can actually crank these down. So if you want to, you can just turn this down to like 40%, and we've got a frame rendered of that as well. So here you can see is the image rendered at 40% without using the HDR expose. It actually gives you a little bit more reasonable effect. We knew that those light probe image pixels were really, really bright, so I just turned that down immediately before I did the render. Now obviously with the high dynamic range data in the LightWave render engine, the HDR expose is very important. Now we've been playing around a lot with this high dynamic range data. We've been taking a look at how HDR expose works, but we really haven't talked too much about how you get that white point and black point settings. Where does that 1 and 100% come into play? Well, to understand that, first of all, we have to take a look at how we convert back and forth between integer values and floating point values. Obviously, when we're in integer color space, we're working on steps from 0 to 255. When we're in floating point, we're talking 0 to 1. So let's take a look here of an animation that shows us sort of how those things play together. Okay, now first of all, what we can see here is that we have red, green, and blue, and those colors can be anywhere from 0 to 255. You see as we step through here, at 0, of course, each color is black, and then you get various degrees of those colors as we go up in through those 256 steps. That's again 0 to 255, which is 8 steps, which is what we refer to as 8 bits. Okay, so those 8 bits actually come from 2 to the 8th power. So we can see here, when we talk about 8 bits, what we're actually talking about is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, and so on, until you get 8 2s, essentially, which is 256 steps. That can be luminosity steps, that could be color steps. All we know is that it is, in fact, 8-bit. Okay, and then when you take the red, green, and blue channels, that's a total of 24 bits. 256 colors of red times 256 colors of green times 256 colors of blue, and that equals 16.777216 million colors, or as we refer to it, 16.8 million colors. So that's where we get 24 bits when we're talking about working in that 24-bit color space. Now the next thing to understand is floating point color. When we switch into floating point is much more accurate, because rather than having merely 256 steps, we go from 0 to 1 with a sliding decimal. So that means it can be as accurate, as high or as low as we want it to be. It can be any fraction of 1 point anything or point anything, and it can go up as high as we want. It can go to 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, whatever. Now how does that convert? Well, here we go. First of all, if we have an integer value of 0, the floating point value is 0. That's quite clear. If we have an integer value of 255, the floating point value is 1. So to get things in between those two values, at 255, we just divide that by 255 steps to get floating point, which gives us, of course, 1. 128 integer value would be 128 divided by 255, which gives us 0.5. And finally, if we have a very low integer value, like a 1 setting, 1 divided by 255 is 0.003921. Now, this is why when we work in the HDR expose, the white point starts off at 1, because that 1 represents what level of color value or brightness will translate directly into the 255 white when it converts to integer space. So if you leave that right at 1, anything that's at 1.0 floating point becomes 255 on the output color. If you set that up to 3, then any of those floating point pixels all the way up to 3.0 will then get converted to 255. Now the black point has the same exact thing, but rather than have you fuss with numbers like 0.003921, we just represent that as 100%. So if we continue on here, what we'll see that means is that if you start working with the, again with the white point of value of 1, that's actually representing 100%, which is that 255 in integer space. If we go ahead and crank that up to say, for example, a white point of 8, that means that the brightest pixels can go all the way up to 800% inside that floating point space to then equal out to 255. That allows us to sort of expand the range of brightness to a much, much higher degree. Now, if we go to the black point, again, as we mentioned, 100% represents one tick on an integer, which is 1 divided by 255, or 0.0039. That's a really messy number to deal with, and so rather than having you deal with that number directly, we just set that as a percentage, and then that way you can dial that number up by just increasing the percentage value. So if you want the blackness to start 500% higher, you just type 500% instead of having to go in and type 5 times 1.0039, which would be 0.0195. So we're basically just saving you some math there by creating the percentage slider rather than having a floating point value listed there. So essentially the white point and black point that we set there in LightWave are just representations of where in the brightness of the scene do we cut off at 100% white or 255 white and 0 black. Again, by setting the white point higher, it allows more bright pixels to be in that top range, and setting your black point higher allows more dark range to be exposed in to that dark integer-based space. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about are the floating point and HDR formats that we can actually export out and import into LightWave. This is very important because if you're going to take advantage of the HDRD in LightWave by rendering out with high dynamic range data, and then you want to bring that back through for post-processing, you have to make sure you save the image in the appropriate format. So we have here, if we open up the image editor, I've got a few frames loaded in here. The first one is the FLX format. That's the LightWave flexible format. And you can see that that contains 128 bits of data. That's 32 red, 32 green, 32 blue, and 32 alpha. If we go ahead and take a look here, you can see that you would save that using the flexible format, or .flx, found in the pop-up. If we go down here, we've also got Cineon. This is 10-bit Cineon. And we also have the HDR format. Okay? This is the format from Radiance. And again, if we come in here, you can see here's your Cineon, and you'll notice it says FP right in the back end of it there, and then the Radiance format, which is .hdr. Radiance is a radiosity rendering engine, and they were, I believe, the first program to actually incorporate high dynamic range data. So just make sure that if you're going to be working with the high dynamic range imagery or data as it's saved out of LightWave, you need to save out in one of these formats. If you do not, as LightWave exports it out to the other standard formats like Targa or TIFF or JPEG, you will lose all the high dynamic range information because that image is going to be compressed down into regular integer space. Okay, now let's talk about radiosity in practice a little bit more. So far we've been talking mostly about using sky domes, and sky domes set up the lighting with a very broad range of lighting, which requires actually a higher level of radiosity rays to be fired off. Now in this case what we have is a very simple scene. We've got one light in the scene, which is right above the character here. And it is, in fact, a spotlight. We can see there, if we look through the light itself, you can see it shining right down on the character. And because we are using a very bright spotlight, we can actually reduce the number of rays drastically. So we're going to turn off anti-aliasing here, so we can just get a quick render. And we're going to go into our global illumination options, again on the Lights tab under Global Illumination. And you can see right now I'm at a 4:12. I'm going to turn that all the way down to 1:3 and make a test render. You can see here, it actually renders very, very rapidly, and the diffuse smoothing smooths that right out. And what we get is the radiosity effect. So we still have a nice effect of the light bouncing up off the floor and illuminating these under surfaces, but you get it at a much, much better speed. Now let's go ahead and turn off radiosity and take a look at this frame if we didn't have radiosity turned on at all. And you can see, still looks pretty good, but notice how all the details underneath the robot's arms and legs just all disappears. That's because there's no light bouncing off the floor anymore. So again, if we see here, the radiosity really enhances the overall quality of the frame, but without much cost at all on render times. And especially if we're using motion blur, you're going to get a really nice result. Let's go ahead and take a look at an animation. And the first animation is actually the non-radiosity rendered animation. And you can see here, looks pretty cool, but you'll notice that there's not a lot of detail on the underside. Okay, you can see there he is with motion blur, he's jumping around. Now notice there's no speckling on the floor. Of course, this is without the radiosity, so now we're going to switch to the radiosity render. And again, this is using 1:3 rays. Okay, you notice there's no flickering, there's no speckles, but you still now do get the nice underside shading from the light bouncing up off the floor to illuminate the underside of the robot. Okay, so again, depending on the scene that you're using, you can actually use more or less rays. So the rule of thumb when working with radiosity is to keep in mind basically how spread out your lighting effect is. If you're using lights inside of LightWave, actual lights, you can generally get away with a lower setting of rays unless that light is only shining in a very specific area of the scene. Keep in mind that each pixel is going to fire out those rays, and it has a greater likelihood to hit your lighting effect if there are more rays. However, if you have a fairly uniform lighting effect all over the entire scene, you can use a lower number of rays because you don't need that high number to increase the likelihood. If everything is pretty much the same, or if you're using a bright light like we were in this case, it's going to wash out any speckle effects you'd see anyway, so it really helps out to keep your rays low because that'll speed the thing up. Really, you can find this out very quickly just by doing a couple test renders. And again, as we mentioned earlier, keep in mind while you're doing test renders that for your final render, if you're using motion blur or multipass rendering, again, that's a good time to decrease the number of rays because you're going to get those extra rays for free. Now, there's another way to save time on radiosity rendering, and that's what we call scene baking or surface baking. This allows us to actually take an object and render it one time, and LightWave's LW Baker will bake in either to a vertex color map or into an actual image map that can be remapped onto the object to represent the actual lighting, including radiosity, caustics, and any other lighting effects you have in the scene. It will also bake image map textures as well as procedurals. So let's take a look at how we might set that up. Okay, we're going to start out with a little castle scene here. And this is a scene that was set up by Kenneth Woodruff. Pretty cool little scene. Now you notice that we've got a nice little castle here. If we look around, we can see that it's got a nice texture, but the lighting effects are not too dramatic inside of OpenGL because you can't really see more than just the base light. So if we move around here, you can see, okay, it's pretty cool. Kind of fun to roam around in there. But what we want to do is see the actual lighting effects. So first of all, let's just go ahead and take a look at a single frame rendered. And we'll go ahead and generate that. And this has several shadow map lights. It's got several point lights doing ray tracing. So what we're going to do is actually create a UV map on the object that we can then, Surface Baker will use that UV map while LightWave is rendering to calculate a new image map that would map back onto that UV texture to appropriately texture the image with the actual lighting effect. Here's the end result of our single frame rendered, and you can see it's a pretty cool environment. You got some nice bright lights in the hallways, some nice shadowing effects around in here. So how will we bake that into the object? All right, well, let's just go ahead and take a look. First of all, we just got to jump over to Modeler, so we click on the Modeler button there. And there's our Modeler open. And you can see here's our object. So again, what we need to do is create a UV map for this guy. And creating UV maps, not too bad. But in LightWave, we've got a new UV mapping mode called Atlas. Now, normally, you just go down to create your texture, and we'll call this Castle Bake. And all we need to do, without knowing anything about UV mapping at all, is come down here and choose Atlas, and that's going to create a UV map for the entire object. Now, let's take a look at that map. Okay, you can see every polygon has been given its own unique space inside that UV map. All right, looks pretty cool. That's basically all you need to know to do a bake for an environment. You just want to go in there and create the atlas. You can also bake characters. You can bake anything. It's a lot of fun, actually. We'll go ahead and save the object here. We'll just call it Bake Me. Okay. Very good. And now what we'll do is come over to Layout here. I'm going to go ahead and replace this current Arc Castle object with our Bake Me object. So we'll go back up to Replace. Replace with object file. There's Bake Me. Okay, it looks the same, but now this object has that special UV map that we created with Atlas. So now what we want to do is go to our surface editor. You can see here. And under shaders, there's an option called Baker. Now you notice I didn't pay any attention to which surface I picked, and there's a reason for that. You don't have to apply this shader baker to all the surfaces. Surface Baker gives you an option to actually bake all the surfaces of an object at once. So now what we're going to do is double click on Surface Baker. That'll open up its options. And we'll just bring the panel there. And what you see is we have several options for baking. You can bake the color. You can bake the diffuse, which is how much light is bouncing off it. You can bake the illumination, which is just the effect of the lighting. You can bake shaders, so if you're using procedural shaders or plug-in shaders. You can tell it continuous map. This basically tells it whether or not to add smoothing between the polygons. I generally leave this on so you get nice smooth textures. And then here's the option I mentioned for bake entire object. If you have an object with multiple surfaces, this will actually go ahead and bake it across the entire object without you having to apply the shader on all the different surfaces. Now we have Bake To, and this allows us to pop up here for Bake To Image or Bake To Object. Bake To Object will actually create a color vertex map that can then be applied back to the object. Right now, we're talking about the image map type, and we'll come back to the object baking here in a little bit. Okay, so choosing the image type, that requires a UV map. So we choose that castle bake map that we just made a minute ago. Now we've got the image resolution, and we're going to go ahead and set that to 1024. Now, the reason we have to crank that resolution up is this is a fairly large object. And keep in mind that Atlas Mapping created one single UV map for the entire castle. All right, so now this image that I'm going to create with the baking process is going to be mapped across that entire environment. Now in this case, it's a little extreme. Even 1024 probably isn't going to be large enough. Generally what you'll want to do is take segments of the model and bake each segment separately so you can have several high-resolution maps for each little environment. And we'll see when we get the final result what happens with the map at this resolution stretched across the entire image. It still looks good, but you can see that the resolution isn't quite there in some sections. All right, next two pop-ups here, pretty straightforward. You've got image type. This is what kind of type we want to save out as. We'll tell it we want a 32-bit targa. And then finally, the image base name. It defaults to SB for shader baker and the name of the surface. We're going to call this Castle Bake instead. And LightWave will automatically add the .tga extension for us. Now there are three settings down below here. One is for anti-aliasing. So if you want, it will actually anti-alias the texture for you. Then there's the shading noise reduction. This is the same shading noise reduction we have on the global illumination panel. Since most of my lights are pretty sharp anyway, I'm not going to apply that in this case. And finally, we have a view image option. This just tells LightWave that once it's done baking, to view the actual baked image. All right, so let's go ahead and bake this map here. And you'll see it goes ahead and computes the shadow map, and it won't start baking until LightWave actually takes a peek at one of the surfaces that has that shader baker surface applied to it. Okay, so now we see the baking in progress happening. It has to update the geometry. It's going to process that. Now it's creating the image file, and this is the part that takes a little bit of time. You can see here, it's going to take maybe a couple minutes to generate. But the couple minutes you spend baking, it's actually baking the entire object. So normally when you think about the camera's perspective, looking at one section of an object and rendering, it may only take 30 seconds to a minute. This is actually baking the entire world. So now you'll be able to move your camera around freely, and the lighting is already baked into that image map. So it's well worth the time up front that you would spend to create these maps, because then you'll never have to render those effects again. All right, so then you can have characters, whatever you want in the scene, and they can have lighting effect in them, but your environment lighting is already baked in. This is also very, very cool for gaming companies, because they can now take, and with radiosity, caustics, all the procedural textures, and they can bake these maps that they can then run in the real-time games, and it looks gorgeous just like a final LightWave render, except for it's in real time. So again, yes, it takes a little bit extra time to bake these things, but boy, do you save a lot of time on the backside, because now you can render this environment in mere seconds as opposed to minutes per frame. Okay, so you can see that because we had the view image option, once the image was finished rendering, it drops this right here for us. Now, one thing to keep in mind, when you're baking an object, once the shader baker dialog is dismissed, you can cancel the regular render. It doesn't need to finish the render, the image is already baked. Now in this case, you can see our 1024 image goes out beyond the limits of our image viewer. So if I hold down the Alt key on my keyboard, I can actually drag around this image inside that restricted view window. Okay, and it's pretty cool to look at. What you're seeing, you can see the arches here. You can see the effect of the shadows on the ground. Here is the stairwell. You can see all the different little areas, the little lights in those little arches. So you can see them here, 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 and here. All right. Now let's just go over to Modeler, and let's apply this to the model itself. I'm going to go ahead and go to our image editor. I'm going to load that guy up. There we go, Castle Bake. And we'll just go ahead and zoom in over here. So one of the nice things about 6.5 is when you're in the UV texture mode for a window viewport, this little area here, which is normally the visibility, turns into an image pop-up. So you can choose your background image right there. Now you can see we need to increase the resolution of the background image. So we hit the D keypad, or we can go to Display Options on our Display tab. We'll just hit D here. And you can see here, here's your texture resolution. This is for the resolution of texture maps that are on your objects. But we want the backdrop resolution. So go to Backdrop here, and you can see we've got down to 128 right now. That's a 1024 by 1024 map. So let's choose 1024. We say OK. And now you'll notice we have a much cleaner map inside there. And again, you can see how this map matches up perfectly with the little areas of the UV texture. Okay, here's the stairs with the light shining on those, so on and so forth. Okay, so now what we want to do is actually apply that to the geometry. So to do that, we go over to our surface editor. We choose all the surfaces at once by just shift clicking. Go to the color texture. Tell it we want it to be an image map. We want to use UV mapping. We want the Castle Bake texture. And we want the Castle Bake image. Okay? And now that's applied. We say Use Texture. Now the next thing I want to do, because our object already has the lighting built into it, we don't need to receive any diffuse lighting at all. So I'll turn off any textures, turn off any specularity, turn off any bump maps, turn our diffuse all the way down to 0, and our luminosity all the way up to 100. That ensures that we're seeing 100% strength of the map. Now let's take a look at how that looks in OpenGL. Keep in mind now, we're seeing this here in real time. So now we've got the effect of our lighting baked into the object itself. Okay, pretty cool. We can zoom in, move around. Look at it again. You can see the lights and little tunnels up in here. Let's go ahead and just save this object. Call it Bake Me 3. And let's go into Layout so we can drive around inside that image, or that object rather. So we'll clear the scene here. And load the object. And again, if we go to our camera view, move our camera, get right inside there. And change our grid size a little bit so we don't move quite so rapidly. And again, you can see, even though our original render, remember our camera when we rendered this image was down in here. Whoops. There we go. Was down in here. Okay, so this was pretty much all our camera could see then. But you'll notice now, even though that was all it could see, Shader Baker, because of the UV map, could see everything. And it could see back here in these hallways. And that's all now burned into that image. So you can see how beneficial this would be to a real-time environment, because now you can take advantage of all the cool rendering functions inside of LightWave 3D in your real-time game. And again, if you're using this to cut your render times in LightWave, you can just use higher resolution maps and more maps to get very accurate rendering effects. You'll even notice that this surface here had a gradient on the bottom to give sort of a nice green, mossy effect on the bottom of the walls, and then fading off into the gray brick textures on the top. Even that comes through in the shader baking. So shader baking, a very, very powerful way to either create real-time environments for gaming or just to simply cut your render times by creating built-in lighting effects. And I'm going to load up our good friend, the cow. So again, we go to our LightWave content directory. And there's the cow. And there's our lovely view of the cow. Let's just bring him around here a little bit. There we go. And we can see if we look from up here, the lighting is strong on one side. We're going to go ahead and give a little bit more dramatic shading so we can really see that in the point map. Okay, so we can see a nice bright side here, a dark side here. Now keep in mind, our cow has procedural textures. So if we do a quick render there, you can see this is actually a procedural fractal noise texture that's been applied to the cow. So we want to bake this in at each vertice. Okay, so if we look at the object here, let's take a look at it in wireframe. You can see each one of these little polygons is connected by a point. So essentially, anywhere there's a cross point, LightWave will be able to bake the color into that section. So again, to do that, very simple. You go to your surface settings, choose one of your textures. Generally, it's a good idea to choose one of the larger surface areas. The reason we do that is that because because Baker is a shader, it only gets called if LightWave sees it during the render. So for example, if I had chosen one of the surfaces on the cow, like the cow's tail, which is not visible by the camera, Surface Baker would never get called, and so it wouldn't get any kind of baking effect. So it's always a good idea to pick one of the surfaces that's obviously visible through the camera to set it up. So we've got the cow hide, which is obviously visible. Choose LightWave Baker. Again, same options here. We're going to leave color, we want diffuse, we want illumination. We don't have any shaders, so we don't need to bake that. We do want to bake the entire object, but now instead of baking to an image, we want to bake to object. And you can see it now asks me for a VMAP name. So we're going to call that Moo. And that's it. Now we're going to go ahead and hit render. And what we'll see is you get a quick error message, which tells us only faces with 3 or 4 vertices can be baked. Other faces will be ignored. Now in this case, we're okay with that. In the case where you're baking an actual UV mapped object, you might want to go into Modeler and select all polygons that have more than 3 or 4 points in them and just do a triple. Then you can come back in and bake the object. Now another nice thing you can do with that is you can actually keep your original object that has the higher number of points in the polygons, take another object, do the triple, bake that, and you can use the same texture and UV map on the original object and it'll match up just fine. It's just that Baker, when it's creating the map, needs to see triangles or quads. Okay, we'll go ahead and say that's okay, and it goes. And you notice how fast that went compared to creating the UV map, or creating the texture map. That's because it doesn't have to generate an image, it's just applying a color at each point. It has to do a lot fewer samples. Now we'll go ahead and remove the Baker here, and now it's time to apply this. So if we're just going to move that over so we can see the cow, move that over. We'll go over here to the Advanced tab, and you'll see under Vertex Color Map right here, we can choose Moo. Okay? And notice now, if we look back out here, the cow all of a sudden looks like the cow when he's rendered. Now it's not quite as accurate because again, it has to blend between points, but you get a pretty good representation. And watch on the back side, you see, totally shadowed. We have the actual lighting effect right in there. Now one of the things you can do here, let's go ahead and disable that. Go back to shaders, activate Baker, and we're going to turn off Bake Illumination and Bake Diffuse. And this will give us just a color map. So we'll go ahead and set it to Object, and we'll call this Moo Color. We'll say OK. Hit render. It's going to give us the same error. We'll just ignore that and keep going. And again, we go to Advanced, choose Moo Color. And now you can see I've got the color on all sides, but now it's actually taking advantage of the lighting from LightWave. Okay, so you've got no shading baked in. If I set back to just the Moo, you'll see I get the shadow back in there because the shadow is baked into the vertex map. So if you want, you can actually use this to just bake very high detailed textures into an object. So for example, you might have a character that has 15 layers of procedural textures. It takes several minutes to render because of the complexity of the texture maps, or excuse me, of the procedural textures and texture maps that are layered. Well, now you can bake that into an image map or a vertex map, and then without baking the lighting, you just apply that, and then it'll take on the actual lighting, but all the color information will be baked down to one image or a vertex map. You can really save some time that way. Gives you some really good flexibility. Okay, so that's exactly how we would set that up. Again, you can see now you've got the nice vertex color map. If you want a more accurate vertex color map, what you can do is you can actually subdivide your object, because the more points that are in there, the more accurate it can be. Because keep in mind, you can see a good example of it here on the side. From one point to the next, all it can do is blend. So this point here was very black. This point here was very white. You can see the polygon right there, how it just blends from black to white and gives you a linear fall off. So if you want to increase the resolution, essentially, of that vertex map, you just have to increase the number of points in your object. But again, a great way to cheat things. Another nice thing you can do with the vertex map is you can create what we call an accessibility map. So what you can do here is you can take an object that has lots of little crevices and go ahead and bake just the illumination in. And that way, areas that are sort of obscured or hidden will be darker. It kind of dirties the object up. And you can then apply this in combination with the actual lighting of LightWave. This doesn't override. This actually works with texture maps. It works with procedurals. It just gets added on top of the actual surfaces of the object. Now, if you wanted to take advantage or take completely over the surface, what we do then is, let's go ahead and choose all of the textures here. We just shift, select that entire bank. Make sure our vertex color map is set to Mu. Okay? Now, if we want the baked texture to be the only texture we see, what we do then is go over to Basic Settings, turn down Diffuse, and turn Luminosity up to 100%. So now what you're seeing is only the effect of the vertex map. Okay? No matter what we do with the light here, it's not going to change. This is 100% of that map. Again, if you want to mix and match those things, you just turn your luminosity back down, put your diffusion up, and then under Advanced, you can actually change the percentage that blends in. So you can blend this in live just by dialing up that slider. Let's go back to Mu Color, and you can see there how you can change the vertex map. So a very, very powerful way to create some details on your object very rapidly without having to create a texture map. Again, using both the shader baker for creating images or shader baker for creating vertex maps, you can bake in the effects of colors, lights. This works with caustics effects. This works with radiosity. It works with all kinds of different effects built into LightWave. We saw it working with gradients, texture maps, procedurals, the whole ball of wax. Well, I mentioned caustics, and we've talked about them briefly throughout the tape, but we haven't actually experienced caustic lighting effects. In the case of radiosity, we're bouncing light off of diffuse surfaces. In the case of caustics, we're reflecting light off of reflective or refracting light through refractive surfaces. So this is the same effect that you see when you see a glass on the table and the light shining through creates a hot spot on the other side. Or when you reflect light off your watch and it bounces on the wall across the room. So this is something that's very unique to LightWave. There are not very many programs that will actually calculate the caustics effect. It's actually pretty straightforward to set up, and it creates a very nice, subtle, realistic effect in your render. Let's take a look at how we set that up. Okay, now, so that you can follow along, we're just going to go to our LightWave directory here. And we've got a caustics directory inside there. And we'll load up the scene called Caustics Ring Slow. Luckily, when this was created, computers were slower. Now computers are so fast, this is a pretty fast render to do. Now we're going to turn off anti-aliasing here, just for now, so we can do a quick render. And we'll leave our resolution at 720 by 46, that's fine. Now what we want to do is take a look at the Lights tab, the Global Illumination Settings, and you can see here we have caustics enabled. Okay? Now if we take a look at our scene here, we'll go to our perspective view, a little perspective here, and you'll see our point light is here. Now the point light is radiating rays down this way, and they're going to bounce off the ring here, they're going to bounce off the ring here, and it's also going to create shadows. So let's go ahead and make a render. And you'll see it first emits the caustic rays, which is essentially spraying the rays out from the lighting effects and bouncing those off surfaces. And you see that then it gets accumulated or fanned out depending on the concavity or the convexity of the surface. So you can see on the inside, the rays hit and get focused into this hot point here. The outside, they hit and get sprayed out. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the caustic settings. So go back to Global Illumination, and you see we have some pretty straightforward settings here. The intensity just tells you how bright these pixels are going to be once it bounces off. The accuracy is essentially the number of rays that are getting sprayed multiplied by a factor. So it's actually more than 1200. It's probably multiplied by a factor of 100 or a factor of 1000. But all you need to know is if you want to increase the resolution of the caustics effect, you just crank up the accuracy. The softness setting is basically a blurring effect. So each caustic ray that gets fired out, when it hits a surface, the higher the softness range is, the more that little pixel that gets illuminated will be spread out, sort of blurred, so that all these little caustic rays are bouncing off here, landing on the surface here, and then being softened so that they kind of blend together. And it gives you that really nice effect. Now, just like radiosity, caustics benefits from multi-pass rendering. So if you're using things like motion blur or just enhanced anti-aliasing, each time it re-renders the frame, you'll get another pass of the caustic rays being fired out there. So you can actually decrease, again, your number of rays if you're using multi-pass rendering, because you'll multiply the number of rays times the number of passes. And then LightWave will blend those together to give you a very nice, smooth result. Okay, now there's another type of caustic effect, which is caustic light refraction. So we're going to go ahead and jump back over here. I just change to my content directory. I've got a simple scene here that we used earlier to illustrate the ray tracing effects. And it's got not only some reflective surfaces, but it's got some nice refractive surfaces, which is what we want. Okay, so here's our scene. And we'll go ahead and take a look at our light panel here. Got the light turned up a little high. We're going to bring that down to about 100%. And again, we go to our global illumination, and we have our caustics enabled. You see there we've got a much higher intensity, a little lower accuracy, and a little lower softness value. Go to our camera properties here, and we'll just go ahead and leave it with no anti-aliasing. Do a quick test render. Again, see it's fired out the rays already. And now you'll notice that as it's drawing the refractive surface, you'll see underneath where there should be shadows is actually kind of a bright area, because that surface has actually accumulated some of those caustic effects. And you can see now underneath there, the caustic effects distorting the shadow. This is also a great time for us to use the FP image viewer for the image expose. Because what we can do now is you can see that because this blue surface is pretty bright from the white light already, if we crank that up a little bit, you can see it pulling the caustic effects out a little brighter. You see there? Now you can really start to see the caustic effect as it's shining through to the back side. And you can see there this sort of spiraling effect that you're getting from the light. As it comes through, the caustic light sort of bands out and illuminates the surface underneath. Now again, you can make some changes. If you want to go to global illumination, you can turn up your intensity if you really want to see those brighter. Turn up your accuracy a little bit. And maybe increase the softness. Now there's another setting here which is cache caustics. This works similarly to the cache shadow map options that we talked about in Render 1, where it actually fires the rays once, caches that information so that on every subsequent render it will always have the same caustic effect. This is great, again, if you have an object that's static in the scene and you want it to be creating a caustic lighting effect on a surface underneath it, you cache the rendering of the caustics so it doesn't recalculate every frame. Of course, you can't use this if any object that's creating caustic effects is going to move, because it would move away from its caustic effect, which would look just bizarre. Okay, so here we go. You see, we crank that up, and now you'll notice on screen here, the caustic effects are much brighter, so it's really overexposed or washed out. So we just go again to our settings here for the image controls, image exposure. And once again, you can see if I click on the screen here, my pixel settings are about 300% for blue. That's pretty darn bright. So we'll go ahead and set this back up to 3. And again, that brings the caustic light effect right back into place. So we can see that clearly underneath there. And again, if we want to bring that up a little higher and bring up our black point, you can see the caustic light now again as it's shining through here and creating this nice illumination on the backside. So it's a subtle effect, but it really does create a nice addition in terms of photorealism. I'm going to go ahead and clear the scene here, and we'll bring in an image file. And we've got our little death snail guy. We've seen him before. Okay, there he is. And again, you'll notice that was saved out in the flexible precision format. So we get the full 128 bits of depth there. We're going to go to our Scene tab under Compositing, and we're going to put this in the background. All right. Now, since this is in the background, I can go to my Image Processing tab, and I can add image filters. Let's go ahead and change our camera's resolution first of all to make sure it matches the resolution of the image. It's low res, so we'll set that to 50%. No biggie. Okay, now we go back to the image processing tab, and here you can see we can choose the different image filters. In this case, the LightWave Virtual Darkroom. Now if I double click on that and open it up, you get this wacky panel. And what you'll see here, there are several different options, and this is really a highly technical plugin that relates directly to the same settings that you would find when you're processing film. In fact, you'll notice some tables here with a massive number of variable entries. I don't recommend to anybody going through here and changing these numbers. These actually match up with the measured film feedback that we've gotten from companies like Kodak. They have these posted on their websites. And our friend Robert Gauger, actually, who was the creator of the LightWave Virtual Darkroom, downloaded that information and has input that for us automatically. It includes things like the film curve, the paper curve, and the MTF curve, spectral sensitivity, so how sensitive it is to the different wavelengths of light. Then, of course, the basic settings here, the negative lux and negative time, the positive lux and positive time. These are essentially the film processing settings that you'd have when you're developing film. So how much light is going through the negative to create the original, or going to create the original negative, how long that negative is exposed, and then how much light goes through that to create the positive, and how long that positive is exposed to create that. So you can create some interesting effects. Okay, what I usually do is just use one of these standard presets up here. There's also a list of files you can load new settings. We can actually go into your programs directory, and you'll find some LWVDR presets. You can see these .VDR files. These come with 6.5b and 6.5 off the website, so you can download those directly and load those right in. We're just going to use our T-Max 100 Polymax. Actually, let's go with the Super 100. So I want the color film. And you've got a negative lux of 2. I'm going to go ahead and just leave that. This is going to be a little overexposed. Let's go ahead and do that, and you can see how that kind of creates this grainy, sort of old-looking film, which is kind of cool. But I want to pull some of those shadows out of there. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and open that back up, and I'm going to decrease the negative time so that it's not exposed to so much light. So set that down to 2, and you'll see now when it processes, it's a little bit darker, still not quite there. So we'll set that all the way down to 1. Render again. And now you're starting to get some pretty interesting old film effects. And what you'll notice if we zoom in there, notice how the shadow is tilted towards that brown effect. Kind of cool. And again, you can also still go in and use your exposure settings to pull that up even more. Like this. We'll crank our shadows down a little bit. And you can tweak with that. You can create some cool old-looking sort of sepia tone film. You'll notice it gives you a little bit of grain built in there as well. You can adjust the grain settings right in the virtual darkroom. You can see here the enable grain, the Selwyn's granularity. And again, if you want to bring up the values, you can give it a little bit more positive lux value and a little more positive lux. So as you can see, the virtual darkroom gives you a very powerful way to post-process your LightWave 3D renders. Of course, you probably get the idea by now that high dynamic range data inside of LightWave is a very important part of the application. Most people who are used to working with traditional graphics applications have never considered working beyond the normal ranges of pixel values. And now that LightWave gives you access to that, there's a lot of things you can do. Of course, if you have experience in a traditional darkroom, you'll probably be even more comfortable in the virtual darkroom. It's a great way to play with the post-processing of those images. And in combination with the HDR exposed, you can get some really nice effects. Now, we've talked a lot about the general rendering engine and options on the camera panel. There are some rendering options on the lights and objects panels for treating your images. Let's go ahead and take a look at what we can do on those two panels. And what we're going to talk about are the options for lights rendering controls. You can see here we have 4 different flagged settings. One is Effect OpenGL. Of course, if we turn this on and off, it's just going to change the lights effect in OpenGL. This will have no effect on your final render. It's just what we can see here in your OpenGL screen. You also have the option for Effect Diffuse, Effect Specular, and Effect Caustics. Let's go ahead and show you why we might want to flag these things on and off. First of all is add an extra light here. So go to my Add Light. Let's make a point light. And we're going to call it Spec Light. And what I want to do is I want to take this ball here and give it some specularity on its surface. So there's our ball. And we'll turn up the specularity. And we'll make it a little bit shinier. And let's make sure it's got a little bit of reflection as well. And again, as we did earlier, we'll go to our Environment tab, and we'll set the reflections to use ray tracing and backdrop. Which, once more, we need to go to our rendering options and make sure shadows, reflections, and refractions are on. Very good. And now what we can see in OpenGL as we move this around is the specular highlight changing from the light that we've added to the scene. Now you can see it's a little bit dimmer than the other spec highlight. That's because if we go to the light's properties panel, you see the light itself is only set to 50%. Let's turn that up to 150 so you get a really bright specular highlight. And let's maybe tilt it a little bit towards yellowish. Okay, so here you can see our light. We can get the specular highlight. But what's happening is, if I do a test render here, you can see not only is it adding that specular highlight, but it's also illuminating the rest of the scene. It's washing out our shadows on this side. It's really creating dark shadows on the other side. And all I really wanted to do was just add in a little specular light there on the side. So what we can do is we go to the light's properties. And you can see here, I can turn off Effect Diffuse. We'll leave Effect OpenGL on so we can still see the spec highlight there. And we'll just leave Effect Specular. So now when we do our render, you'll notice that the rest of the scene, it's still getting your spec highlight here and here from this light, but now the shadowing and the diffuse light from the rest of the scene is no longer being blown out by that light existing in the frame. Okay? Now, let's say, for example, we want the spec highlight on the sphere, but not on the ring over here. So that's where we go to the Objects properties, and we can go to our Object panel. And you can see here we have all of our different primitives. We'll go down to the disk. Actually, the refract object is what we want. We choose that, and at the bottom of the panel, you'll see all the different lights in the scene. The spec light, the first light, radiosity, and caustics. All right? This is the light exclusion options. So in here, I can tell it to not use the spec light. I just exclude that from the scene. You'll notice when I turn that on and off in the OpenGL here, you'll see the specular highlight from that object just disappear. So we deactivate that, and again we make our render, and now you'll notice it's still getting the specular highlights from the light off screen over here, but it's no longer picking up that spec highlight from this light on this side. Okay, there are some other options for the ray tracing of the object in this little environment here. So what we want to do now is talk about some of the unseen by options. Let's say, for example, we look at our frame here. We can see in our sphere, this object here is reflecting quite nicely. Now, if for some reason we don't want that to reflect in the sphere, maybe we have an object that's off screen, we want it to reflect on some objects but not on another one, well, we simply go back over to our Objects properties, choose the appropriate one, in this case it's the disk, and tell it to be unseen by rays. Now we do our render, and you'll see even in the refraction here, this object is no longer being treated. You notice in the reflection here, its shadow still shows up, but the object doesn't. Now you might ask why it's still casting a shadow. That's because the light we're using here is a shadow map shadow. If this were a ray traced light, that shadow wouldn't show up either because obviously this object is now unseen by rays, which is evident inside the missing refraction here and of course the missing reflection there. Now another time we might want to use things like light exclusion is if we want to set up a rim light or a specific light to a particular object. So what we're going to do is add another light here. This is going to be a spotlight, and we'll call it rim. And we'll make it about 300%, so we get a nice hot rim light. And we're just going to move it off screen over here. We'll go to the light's perspective and rotate that around. And kind of move that over a little bit and rotate it. And let's look from our canvas perspective. Okay, you can see now we've got this really hot rim light. It's a little bit too far over. All right. Now if we render that out, you'll see the rim light is really bright on this side, which is the effect we want. We want to give that nice sort of kicker here. But it's also really blowing out the ground and these other objects. So again, this is where something like light exclusion really comes into play. You go to your objects properties, and now you can simply choose the different objects. Let's say we like the rim light on this object, but not on the pyramid. So we'll simply go to the pyramid object, tell it to exclude the rim. We'll go to the ground object, tell it to exclude the rim. And we'll go to the refraction object and also tell it to exclude the rim. Now we make our render, and again you can see these two objects now receive the kicker bright rim light, whereas these objects no longer have it. Again, you can see the difference in frames there from that light exclusion. There are several different options for the exclusion. For example, we've talked about the unseen by rays. You can also hide an object from the camera. And this is pretty interesting. If you want to have a surface of an object that's getting reflections of a lot of items around it and you don't want to use a reflection map, you can actually put items in the scene. Perhaps you want to set up like a box, a big bright white box, so you get a nice white reflection, sort of like a light box in a photo shoot. Well, you can put that in the scene. You can tell it to be unseen by the camera, but leave it being seen by rays. So then when you render, your surface, the reflective surface, will have a really nice reflection of that bright white box, but your camera, no matter where you move your camera, you're not going to accidentally see that box. So if only we could do that in the real world, photo shoots would be a lot easier. Luckily, in the virtual world, we can flag those things to be seen by rays or unseen by camera or even unseen by fog. And the interesting thing about the unseen by fog is there's actually a level setting, so you can actually change that by a percentage here. So if you want it to be only 50% seen by fog, you can just turn that on or off as well. Of course, down here we have the shadowing options. These are pretty self-explanatory. The self shadow will cause the object to put shadows across its own surface. Cast shadow, if you deactivate that, it'll no longer create shadows. And receive shadows if you don't want it to catch shadows from other objects. And again, on the lights panel, you have the effect diffuse, which we've talked about, the effect specular, the effect OpenGL, and of course effect caustics, which is just going to tell it whether or not caustics rays will be fired from that particular light. This is really important because a lot of times you'll have multiple lights in a scene. You might have as many as 20 or 30 lights in certain scenes. And you certainly don't want every single light firing out those caustics rays because it has to calculate the caustics effect for each light that's affecting the caustics. So this way, if you have a particular item in the scene that you want to be creating that caustic effect, you can make sure that only the lights shining on that object are set to affect caustics. Now there's one more effect I want to show you with lighting, and that's the use of negative lights. Now, this is something you wouldn't think of immediately, but inside of LightWave you can actually set a light's percentage to a negative %. Let's go ahead and take a look at how that works. Let's say, for example, in our frame here, you can see we've got our kicker light here. Well, instead of a kicker, maybe what we want to do is make this really dark area. Okay, so we'll just take our kicker light here, our rim light, and instead of 300%, we'll set it to negative 200%. All right, and you can see immediately in OpenGL now, it's actually extracting the light information from that surface. So if we render that, you can see now what it's done effectively is darken up this side. Now, an interesting thing about negative lights is you can actually set a negative light color. So let's say, for example, we want to extract the blue, and now you can even see in OpenGL how that's going to look. It's going to tilt towards green. And I can change the settings, so I can tell it to extract green, which gives it a little bit more of a blue tint, or I can tell it to extract just red. In this case, again, we'll go back to just extracting blue, and now we render that. You can see it's actually going to extract the blue wavelengths out of that surface. Now, this is sort of a strange example, but there are a lot of different uses for working with negative lights. For example, you can actually use negative lights underneath an object. Let's say, for example, you've got a car object and you don't necessarily want to ray trace the shadows for underneath the car. Well, you can take a couple of spotlights and spread them really wide, point them underneath the car, and set them to be negative. So now anywhere the car goes, with those lights going with it, it'll always get darker underneath the car's body, and you don't actually have to ray trace any shadows at all. It's also very useful for things like feet. The cool thing about it is it won't give you a very defined shadow, which is nice because it gives you a soft shadow like you'd find in a radiosity solution. So it's a really nice way to cheat shadows if you want to work that way. Well, as you can see, we've covered a lot of ground, all the way from lighting tricks to light exclusion, object rendering properties, high dynamic range mapping. You've got radiosity, ray tracing. So you've certainly got a lot of toys to play with, so we're going to let you get at it. I hope you've enjoyed this tape, and until next time, keep on rendering.